When a Windows Azure web role gets deployed, you have to supply a host name, and that host name gets automatically mapped into an IP address by the DNS infrastructure. So what I'm going to do is draw a green line down here to separate the two things. On this side we have DNS, the domain name system, and on this side we have Windows Azure. So let's have a host name like planky.cloudapp.net, and that will actually map to an IP address, and let's imagine that that IP address is 10.168.72.27, just as an example. There's no way it's going to be that, but just imagine that's the address. So if this box represents the web role, so this is a web role which has been deployed to Windows Azure, and when we deployed it we specified that we wanted to use that DNS name, then the Windows Azure infrastructure will have mapped that DNS name onto this IP address for us. So if we have somebody sat at a laptop with, let's just say, Internet Explorer, and they type into their web browser http:// and they type planky.cloudapp.net. Let's have a look first of all what happens. Well, the first thing that happens is that IE goes away and formats a HTTP GET request. It's going to ask for the default document, and it needs to send that to a specific IP address. And so what happens next is that the component built into the IP configuration, known as the DNS resolver, it does a lookup into DNS. So in fact it looks for this name, and that gets resolved to this IP address. And so the IP address that is returned is 10.168.72.27. And so this HTTP GET request is sent to this address, which means it ends up at this host, and the default document for whatever the default website is on that site is returned. Now if you have a look at the service configuration.cscfg, you'll notice, let's find one, here it is, you'll notice there is a site. It says the site name is web. That's the default site name. So whatever the default site name is, that is what document would be returned in this thing over here. So we've got this thing over here called web. Okay, that's the basics. Now most people don't want to use names like planky.cloudapp.net. They'd prefer a name like planky.com. And for that we need CNAME records. So let's have a look at how that works using CNAME records. So what we'll do is we'll have DNS on the left hand side of the page, DNS, and let's just do this the way it would actually appear in a DNS record in a DNS server. So we would see an entry which would literally say planky.cloudapp.net, then it would say A, meaning address, and then it would say something like 10.164.72.27. So that is the DNS entry. Okay, but we said that we wanted this to point to a more meaningful site name. So we can put another entry in here, and we'll call this one planky.com. And then we specify that this is a CNAME record. It's a different type of record, a canonical name record, and that points to another host. And in this case it's going to point to planky.cloudapp.net. Okay, so let's have our Windows Azure web role, which has been deployed. it's got its default website, which is part of the site configuration.cscfg, and let's have our Internet Explorer. And so this now wants to go to http://planky.com. http://planky.com. So we know it's going to format an HTTP GET request. And what's going to happen? Well, the DNS resolver is going to do a lookup into the DNS and say, can I have the IP address for planky.com? That's going to return another host address, and the DNS resolver is going to do another trip because this isn't an IP address, it's a host name. So it does another request into the DNS and says, can I have the address for planky.cloudapp.net? And this time it gets this address. So this address is returned, and that's where the GET request goes to. So that GET request now gets sent to the default website, which is running at 10.164.72.27. Great. So you can see now how a CNAME record is going to work on a default website. Now, what if you want more than one website on your web role? What happens in that case? Well, you know that IIS has provision for creating multiple websites, and you can use host headers. So let's have a quick discussion of what a host header is. So when we send our GET request, we have the actual body of the request, but in the header we can have some other information, and we can have a host header. And in here, it can specify the actual DNS site name, like it might say, for example, ops.planky.com. And what that means is, if we have an IIS website which is deployed, IIS, and let's just imagine that this is connected up to the internet at IP address 10.164.72.27, then as long as we have a host header entry in our IIS which says ops.planky.com, and it will typically specify that it lives in some specific physical directory. Let's imagine that lives in the ops directory. Then what happens is the user sends the GET request to ops.planky.com. Ops.planky.com then results in a DNS request going off to the DNS provider, who will return an A record. So in this case, ops.planky.com has an A record of 10.164.72.27, and that means this address is returned as an address record to the web browser. The web browser sends it off to 10.164.27, and that means that this lot of data, the host header and the GET request, end up at IIS, and IIS inspects the host header and sees this part here which says ops.planky.com and says, aha, I need to send this request into this specific website, and in which case the code is being handled by data and files and so on that exist in this directory. Okay, so that's what would normally happen. Now, the difficulty is, of course, that with Windows Azure, the website address, the IP address, can change. There's no guarantee. It's not guaranteed for, a long, persistent amount of time. So we need to have another way of handling that little issue. So bear in mind what host headers do. You can end up at an IP address, and IIS will inspect the host header, extract the DNS name, and determine which site you should go to, hosted on IIS, based on the host header. Okay, so now let's have a look at how multiple sites can exist on an IIS website in Windows Azure, and how you can use CNAME records. Okay, so let's do this again. We have DNS, and this time I'm going to have two sites in Windows Azure. I'm going to have one, the default. I'm going to have the default site. I'm going to have two additional websites. So I'm going to have planky.cloudapp.net. That's going to be an A record, and it's going to live at 10.164.72.27. I'm also going to have one that says ops.planky.com, and this is going to be a CNAME record, a canonical name record, which points to a host. In this case, planky.cloudapp.net. And we know how that resolution works because we talked about it in the first section. And I'm also going to have a site called sales.planky.com. That's also going to be a CNAME record, and that's going to have planky.cloudapp.net. So you can see that at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether you query for planky.cloudapp.net, ops.planky.com or sales.planky.com, all of them are going to eventually resolve to 10.164.72.27. They're all going to resolve to that address. Okay, so now let's deploy our Windows Azure website. Here it is. And on this website, we've got the default website, which is part of the service configuration file. Let me show you the one I'm talking about. You'll all be familiar with this. What's happened here? No, it's down here. My files have disappeared for a little while. It's this one here. Site name equals web. So that's the site that we deploy to planky.cloudapp.net. Whatever DNS name we give the site when we deploy the code to the port using the portal or using Visual Studio as the deployment tool, then that's the name it's talking about. Okay, but I've got two additional sites specified on here. One of them is called ops.planky.com, and the other one is called sales.planky.com. So let's have a folder for ops.planky.com, and let's map both HTTP and HTTPS into the code that's running in that folder. Let's have another one, sales.planky.com. That's got its own folder, and let's map also HTTP and HTTPS into the code that runs in that folder. So that looks like it keeps disappearing all over the place. That looks like this. We can see I've got an HTTP and an HTTPS endpoint. We can see that there is a site whose name is sales, and its physical directory is /sales. So if I go back to the slides, we're really talking about this binding here. We've bound all of that together. And let's go back to the file, the service configuration file. And we can see here that we have the HTTP endpoint with the host header pointing at sales.planky.com, and we can say we've got HTTPS also with a host header that points at sales.planky.com. Okay, then we've got the same thing for ops. So we've got a site called ops and a physical directory /ops, and we can see it has an HTTP binding to the host header called ops.planky.com and an HTTPS binding to the host header called ops.planky.com. So that is this binding here. Okay, so the question is, what IP address do both of those live at? Well, there is only one IP address, and the IP address is whatever the website is bound to, and we know that the website has the name of planky.cloudapp.net. It's there, and that has an A record of 10.164.72.27. So that site is bound to this address. So what I've effectively got is all three of these sites are all bound to one address, 10.164.72.27. But we know that there's this piece of code that lives on IIS, whether it's on Azure or not makes no difference. There's a piece of code that lives on IIS, and what it does is it sees a GET request coming in, and it sees the contents of the request, but it also looks at the host header, and if it sees, let's just say, ops.planky.com, then the GET request got to the correct address because the DNS resolver managed to the DNS resolver in the client computer, in the thing which was running IIS, managed to find the correct address, sent it to IIS, and then IIS just looks this piece of host header data up and finds the relevant site, which is this one, and so this request gets handled by the code that's living in this folder. And it would be the same for sales.planky.com. So it's our host header support in here, in a part of IIS, which is solving that problem for us. Okay, so as far as our DNS provider is concerned then, well, let's not worry about how the DNS infrastructure works in order for me to find IP addresses and how the referrals and all those kinds of things work. But the main thing is that we end up with two DNS entries living in two separate places. This one is managed entirely by Windows Azure. And this one, let's do it in a different color, let's choose purple. This one, with the CNAME records, that one is managed by you at your favorite DNS provider. So wherever you do your DNS that's publicly available on the internet, that's where you create those CNAME records. That obviously means that you very carefully have to choose this name to make sure that that name is deployed before you use the CNAME record, because you may find if you specify this name first and then come to Windows Azure and try to deploy this, it may say that name's already taken. So you need to be a little bit careful about that. Okay, next let's just talk about SSL, because we've got this HTTPS binding in here. So what can we do with certificates? We've got our Windows Azure website. We know that's at 10.164.72.27, and we know there are three sites there, effectively three sites: Cloud App, Planky.cloudapp.net, ops.planky.com, and sales.planky.com. So there's the sales site, there's the ops site, and here really at web is the cloudapp.net site. And we know that each of these is running in its own physical directory. So in order to get the HTTP bindings in there, then we've set up the endpoints in the service configuration file. We've set all the service definition file up, so we need now a SSL certificate. So when we deploy the solution, we need to also deploy a certificate, and the certificate should be issued to star.planky.com. And that means that any subdomain of the planky.com domain will be protected by that certificate for SSL. And because they are ops.planky.com and sales.planky.com, that should work. Great, okay, so I hope that explains it, and I hope that's sort of removed a little bit of the mystery for you.